How the American Empire Operates, Part 2. The American Empire is the largest in the world's history, but also the most invisible. Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified, the new podcast show. I'm your host, S.L. Canton. We bring in perspectives you do not see or hear in the mainstream media. We also have interviews with fascinating guests, so look for them in Spotify, YouTube, and Twitter X. Last week, we talked about why the American Empire wages endless wars and how it justifies the wars through clever propaganda. This week, in Part 2, we continue on the theme and explore all the sophisticated playbooks and Machiavellian tools used by the Empire of Chaos to not only wage wars, but also to control other nations and leaders. Let's start with Atrocity Propaganda. A popular saying goes, the first casualty of war is truth. I will add, the second casualty is humanity. In order to manufacture consent for wars and garner support for mass murder, the other side needs to be dehumanized so that people won't feel guilty or others won't accuse you of war crimes. And atrocity propaganda plays a big role in this process. In the 1970s, the US Senate was more independent than now. It conducted several open investigations which revealed many dark secrets of the CIA. Later, a couple of CIA agents like John Stockwell came out and revealed, for example, how disseminating propaganda is a major function of the CIA. American spies would just completely fabricate stories about, say, Cuban atrocities and Cuban rapists, and these stories would eventually find their ways into Reuters, AP, and all the respectable media. Today we can see this in Israel's attacks on Gaza. On one side, the Israeli officials describe Palestinians as human animals. The use of religion is also being used to justify genocide. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has used biblical references such as the Amaleks, who were completely wiped out. Rabbis in Israel have also used the Talmud to justify killing every woman and child. Thus, Israelis do not feel guilty about killing 14,000 Palestinian children in 7 months. As for atrocity propaganda, Israel spreads lies such as 40 babies beheaded by the Hamas. The New York Times published a sensational article about rape by Hamas, only to admit a couple of months later that there was no evidence. Rape and babies are very commonly used in atrocity propaganda. In the war against Libya, the US media spread lies about Gaddafi soldiers using Viagra to rape women. To drum up support for the Iraq War, the US spread all sorts of lies about Saddam Hussein. For example, stories about Iraqi soldiers throwing babies out of incubators in Kuwait. To attack Syria, the West spread sordid lies about President Assad using chemical weapons when the reverse was true. That is, the US armed jihadist groups used chemical weapons which were presumably supplied by the US and its allies. During World War I, the British spread absurd stories about Germans killing babies with bayonets or making soap out of dead bodies. You can bet there were lots of big lies about World War II as well. The complete dehumanization of Germans gave a free pass to the Americans and the British for slaughtering millions of civilians in cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden using firebombs. Similarly, the use of nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan are quickly swept under the rug. When the US wanted to defeat the Spanish Empire and steal Cuba, the US media spread all sorts of wild stories about Spanish atrocities. William Hearst, the media tycoon, famously told a cartoonist stationed in Cuba, "You furnish the pictures, I will furnish the war." By pictures, he meant drawings and cartoons. Today, the same playbook is used. For example, in Syria, the UK intelligence created a fake group called the White Helmets, whose members are from Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups. These terrorists put on uniforms and pretended to be neutral volunteer services. And they provided all the fake news, fake photos, and staged videos, which were used to accuse Assad and the Syrian government of all sorts of crimes against humanity. To really push the limits of cynicism, the White Helmets were even awarded the Oscars for a short documentary. Another huge target of atrocity propaganda is, of course, China. Whether it's about how 50 million Chinese died during the Great Leap Forward, or how thousands were massacred in Tiananmen Square, or how 1, 2, 3 million Uyghurs are in concentration camps, they're all examples of atrocity propaganda and blatant lies meant to demonize China and to manufacture consent for a war. And it works. In 2018, 53% of Americans had a positive view about China. Today, it's only about 16%. Crocodile Tears. Another way to make people hate another country or leader is to cry crocodile tears for some allegedly oppressed group. For example, it may be the Kurds in Iraq, Chechnya in Russia, Uyghurs in China, or Kosovo in Serbia. Anything that helps to splinter or destabilize a geopolitical rival. However, the same freedom-loving people would never cry for Scotland in the UK, or Catalan in Spain, or the French Canadians, and definitely not for the truly oppressed ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Crying crocodile tears is doubly effective. It not only demonizes the opposition, but it makes the US look like the hero to the rest of the world. For example, the US and some of its Arab allies funded extremist groups in Libya to organize violent protests. When the Libyan government tried to squash the uprising, the West cried, "Dictator Gaddafi is killing his own people." Then within a couple of weeks, NATO started bombing. Libya, which had the highest human development index in Africa, was destroyed for geopolitical reasons. 13 years later, the country is still mired in civil wars without a functioning government. Similar strategies of crocodile tears were used in Syria and Ukraine. In Syria, the US could not carry out a regime change, but was able to splinter and severely weaken the country after a decade of savage proxy war. In Ukraine, the US staged a coup in 2014 and overthrew the democratically elected leader. Remember how Victoria Nuland was passing out cookies to the demonstrators in Kiev? Later, thanks to violent neo-Nazi groups, as well as false flag shootings of police and protesters, the US was able to essentially take over Ukraine and install a puppet regime. Sometimes the campaign of fake tears lasts for years, as we have witnessed regarding Uyghurs in Xinjiang. At some point in the future, I'll do a whole episode on this topic. However, it's enough to say that the so-called genocide of Uyghurs is purely intended to harass and destabilize China. Xinjiang is a vast and strategic region that is rich in natural resources and is also the gateway to Central Asia and Europe. More than 1,000 freight trains that link China to Europe pass through Xinjiang every month. Plus, a vast network of pipelines transports natural gas from Central Asia to Xinjiang. Thus, disrupting Xinjiang means crippling China's economy. In a paper written in the late 1990s, former CIA operative Graham Fuller wrote a white paper in which he predicted that when the US-China relations deteriorate, the US would play the Uyghur card. For decades, the US used the fake Tiananmen Square massacre to demonize China. Now that has been replaced by the Uyghur genocide narrative, which over the last 6 years has played a key role in shaping the opinions of Americans about China. False flag attacks. In the early 1960s, the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff of US military came up with Operation Northwoods, which recommended planting bombs in Miami, in places like malls, and then blaming Fidel Castro in order to invade Cuba. Thankfully, President JFK rejected this idea. In 1967, Israeli fighter jets and torpedo boats attacked USS Liberty, an American Navy ship. The goal was to sink the ship, kill everyone aboard, and then blame Egypt for the attack. When caught, Israel claimed it was a case of mistaken identity. However, the American ship had recorded the conversation between the Israeli military headquarters and the pilots, which proved that Israel was lying. In the recording, the incredulous Israeli pilot kept saying, "Sir, it's an American ship." But the commander replied, "Just shoot." Another stunning example of false flag attacks was the so-called Operation Gladio, which involved NATO-funded groups carrying out terrorist attacks within Europe and then blaming the communists. In fact, false flags and related attacks are very common in history. There is substantial evidence to show that the US blew up its own ship, USS Maine, in Cuba. But thanks to all the atrocity propaganda prior to the incident, the US was able to declare war on Spain within 2 months. And that was the beginning of the global American empire as it colonized the Philippines in Asia. By the way, the term conspiracy theory was created by the CIA after the assassination of JFK. It's a clever term to destroy an argument without substantive discussion. Once a concept is labeled a conspiracy theory, people's minds are automatically inoculated. However, the US establishment freely spreads conspiracy theories about its rivals all the time. As for 9/11, I will leave it up to the audience to make up their own mind. There are plenty of documentaries out there to make one question the official narratives. LIHOP. Another type of provocation related to false flag attacks is what I call LIHOP. Let it happen on purpose. This would be, for example, the sinking of Lusitania during World War I. The British wanted some Americans to die due to German submarine attacks. That would draw the US into the war. Similarly, Pearl Harbor was likely a LIHOP attack as well. The US had broken the Japanese code and were well aware of the Japanese plans to attack Hawaii. Moreover, 1 year before the attack, the famous McCollum Memo specified 8 things to do in order to provoke Japan into attacking the US first. This would help overcome the public objections against the US entering World War II, and the FDR administration followed the memo's advice precisely, including severe oil sanctions to cripple the Japanese military and the economy. The October 7th attack by Hamas might also have been a LIHOP. There were numerous warnings prior to the attack, and they were all ignored by the Israeli government. Interestingly, Netanyahu and his team have repeatedly referred to the October 7th attack as Israel's 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. Blatant lies. Another simple way to start a war is by lying. Yeah, it's that easy if you are a powerful country like the US. The two clear examples are the Iraq War and the Vietnam War. To really escalate the Vietnam War, the US government simply lied about the North Vietnamese attacking American ships. This was the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident. Thanks to this fictitious narrative, the number of American troops in Vietnam skyrocketed from 23,000 in 1964 to 385,000 within 2 years. To start the Iraq War in 2003, the neocons in Bush administration fabricated lies after lies. Saddam Hussein has WMD, weapons of mass destruction, was the core lie. However, there were also other fake claims that linked Saddam to Al-Qaeda. 1 year after 9/11, staggering 66% of Americans, including 77% of Republicans, said that Saddam was personally responsible for the 9/11 attacks. 65% of Americans also said that Iraq was close to acquiring nuclear weapons. The latter claim was based on a fake, forged document that showed Iraq was trying to buy uranium from Niger. Colin Powell, the highly respected U.S. Secretary of State, went before the UN Security Council and waved a vial and claimed that Saddam had biological and chemical weapons. He used the term weapons of mass destruction 17 times during that speech. He went on, "My colleagues, these are not assertions. What we are giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence." And the trend continues. Today, 69% of Republicans view China as an enemy, and 80% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China. In 2017, fewer than half of Americans had a negative view about China. It takes just 5 years of consistent propaganda and fake news to brainwash the masses and prime them to support a war with a new country. All wars begin with demonizing and dehumanizing whoever the establishment wants to kill. Proxy wars. Not all wars are direct wars. There is another clever way to wage inexpensive wars, and that is proxy wars. The first major American proxy war was the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. Wall Street icons like Jacob Schiff funded Japan, and the US helped Japan with oil, steel, armaments, etc. The Japanese successfully destroyed the Russian Navy on the Russian East Coast. Interestingly, during World War II, the Americans armed Russia to defeat Germany. After World War II, the US relied on fundamentalist Islam to stage coups and revolutions in secular Muslim countries like Egypt and Syria. In 1953, the CIA brought the Muslim Brotherhood to the White House to meet with the new president, General Eisenhower. That relationship bloomed and has lasted until today. Over the last 13 years, the Muslim Brotherhood played a key role in fomenting the civil war in Syria. In 1979, the US started arming, training, and funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to wage a proxy war against the Soviet Union. That was quite successful in the narrow goal, but led to the creation of Al-Qaeda, which was, believe it or not, used by the US to wage a second proxy war in the 1990s against Russia in Chechnya. Later in 2012, the US tried the same playbook in Syria. 100,000 jihadists from Al-Qaeda and other groups were flown from all over the world into Syria to fight Assad. It was Mujahideen 2.0. As a WikiLeaks email revealed, Jake Sullivan wrote to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton saying, "The Al-Qaeda is with us in Syria." Here's another shocker. The US and Israel helped ISIS in numerous ways in Syria. Israel supplied food and medicine to ISIS in the Golan Heights. Injured jihadist militants were taken care of in Israeli hospitals, and Netanyahu even visited these soldiers once. As for ISIS fighting deep inside Syria, the US Air Force always mysteriously showed up and attacked the Syrian military to protect ISIS. Kissinger openly said that the US should not defeat ISIS, and US Secretary of State John Kerry admitted in a meeting that the US viewed ISIS as a tool that would give the Americans the upper hand in negotiations with President Assad. In 2014, the US recruited neo-Nazis in Ukraine to stage the Maidan coup in Kiev, and NATO immediately started training neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion. The US hoped to destroy or at least significantly weaken Russia using Ukraine as the cannon fodder. However, that plan is not going very well. By the way, the CIA has been working with the Nazis in Ukraine since the 1950s. Thus, the US has a long history with proxy wars. Finally, the American Empire's last proxy war might be using Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and perhaps India to attack China. The hope is to turn Taiwan into the Ukraine of Asia. Assassination, coups, and election rigging. During the Cold War, the CIA was quite out of control and engaged in all sorts of illegal activities that included election rigging, coups, and assassinations. In Japan, the CIA bribed every politician with cash for decades, ensuring the rule by one party. So much for democracy. In 1948, in Italy, CIA agents walked around with suitcases full of cash to rig the elections. They also planted fake stories in the newspapers, which, by the way, went on all through the Cold War, all over the world, including the US, and still goes on, but in more subtle ways. In Iran, the CIA rented a mob, bribed politicians, and staged a coup in 1954 to overthrow Mossadegh, the popular and democratically elected prime minister, after he nationalized the oil companies. The UK's spy agency MI6 also helped in this coup. In Latin America, the US staged countless coups to install friendly and obedient dictators. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, the list is long. In Central America, some leaders were simply assassinated by the US. For example, the leaders of Ecuador, President Aguilera, and Panama, General Torrijos, were killed by US agents. The US even established the so-called School of Americas to train Latin American dictators on, well, dictatorship. The trainings included not only military skills, but also psychological warfare, torture, extortion, blackmail, and repression of labor unions and civil organizations. In Australia, the so-called Ally, the CIA staged a soft coup in 1975 and purged Prime Minister Whitlam, who was a bit too independent. He was against the Vietnam War. He wanted to move Australia towards the non-alignment movement, and he demanded that the CIA remove its spy station in Australia. That was too much for the American Empire. Confessions of an Economic Hitman. One of the most fascinating and enlightening books is The Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. He's an American who had a very unique job of traveling around the world to ensure cooperation by the leaders of third world countries. First, his job was to get the countries into a debt trap by luring or forcing them into enormous loans from the IMF and the World Bank. These loans essentially let American and Western corporations exploit the natural resources in those countries. Of course, the leaders of those developing countries get to benefit by taking a commission. However, after a few years, the country cannot pay back the loans. In that situation, the country is forced to privatize. This is euphemistically called reforms. Thus, everything from mines and agricultural lands to water and electricity to banks and corporations are put on sale and bought by Western corporations at a great discount. After that, America owns the country. We can see this now happening in real time in Argentina. This is the sophisticated way that American empire conquers much of the world without wars. So what happens when a developing country refuses? That's when people like John Perkins would call in the so-called jackals, whose job is to manufacture coups and assassinations. If that fails, then the US military would invade the country in the name of course, freedom and democracy. The destruction of a country also serves as a warning for others. As the saying goes, you choke one chicken to scare all the monkeys. Thus, for example, the total destruction of Libya is a warning to all the other countries in Africa and the Middle East. The devastating sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela are warning to all the Latin American countries, and so on. How to control the 1%. The US has mastered the way to co-opt the ruling classes of other nations through a myriad of clever incentives. One of the most powerful incentives is the use of offshore accounts where the leaders get to keep their stolen wealth in Western banks. Think of places like the Caribbean, Panama, Switzerland, or the UK's Channel Islands. A British minister called London the money laundering capital of the world. Occasionally, we have leaks like Pandora Papers that reveal how politicians from all over the world stash money in the Western system. Elites from all over the world also invest in real estate in the West, buying luxury apartments in New York, Miami, London, etc. And if these politicians displease the American empire, they will face sanctions from the US, EU, and all their assets will be seized. We have seen in the last 2 years how Russian oligarchs have been deprived of all their wealth abroad. Another popular strategy is to let the children of these politicians attend prestigious universities such as Harvard and Oxford. Surprisingly, this is often as effective as giving millions of dollars in bribes. Educating the upper class of a nation and sending them back home is also very effective because those people do not even understand that they are being bought. They simply learn what they believe are the best economic and business theories, and they go home and implement the American neoliberal system. For example, the head of the World Bank is an Indian American, and one of the top IMF economists is an Indian. These people influence the Indian government, and they do it as sincere evangelists. No need to bribe or coerce. Color revolutions and NGOs. In the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA went rogue and assassinated numerous leaders around the world. Perhaps even President JFK in the US was a victim. So in the 1970s, some of the US senators started rebelling against the deep state. In the famous Church Committee hearings in 1975, the Senate revealed many of the CIA's shenanigans. And some of the CIA operatives also came out, spilled the beans, and even wrote books. The result? The deep state changed its strategy in the early 1980s. The new plan was to fund civil organizations, use sophisticated propaganda to turn people around the world into useful idiots. Thus, let people overthrow their own governments to install pro-US leaders. And it really worked. The US government has numerous groups such as the NED, NDI, and IRI, which are funded and controlled by the US Congress. In a 1991 interview with the Washington Post, NED founder Alan Weinstein admitted a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. In the late 1980s, we saw revolutions in the former USSR and even China. Yes, the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 was a direct product of this CIA strategy. In the 1990s and beyond, the playbook was fine-tuned to create color revolutions, like the Rose Revolution in Georgia 2003, Orange Revolution in Ukraine 2004, Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan 2005, Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia 2011, Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong 2014, etc. In fact, the entire Arab Spring Revolution was orchestrated by the US with a lot of help from Facebook. Yep, all American social media and internet companies are tools of US deep state. The main pillar of the subversion is the funding of the so-called NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. NGO is supposed to mean civil organizations that are independent from the government. That is, such an organization in, say, Thailand cannot accept any funding from the Thai government. But guess what? All these NGOs are funded by the US and European governments. Another big source of these NGOs are big Western corporations and oligarchs, George Soros being the leader of this gang. For example, in Ukraine alone, George Soros's group, the Open Society, spent billions of dollars setting up the grassroots ecosystem over 2 decades. Soros was also behind the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest, and soon his organization was kicked out of China. The local leaders of these NGOs are carefully screened and brought to the US or Europe for training on activism, protests, legal affairs, journalism, etc. And the NGO employees get paid generously relative to the local salaries. Thus, say, someone getting paid $300 a month in a developing country will be very receptive and loyal to the US. We can see the nefarious effects of this in the country of Georgia, where some groups are protesting violently to not reveal the fundings of these NGOs. And this is happening right now. Divide and rule. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the geopolitical mastermind, wrote a seminal book called The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives in 1997. In it, Brzezinski explains how the American empire should control its vassals and tributaries. Yes, he actually used those terms. The US should make sure that the vassals do not collude among themselves, and they should be made dependent on the US for security. One can look at Japan, South Korea, Germany, or even the entire Europe now, and we can see how the US is following Brzezinski's suggestions. When the US blows up the Nord Stream pipelines or creates friction between Europe and China or between Japan and China, we can clearly identify the imperialist actions. Spying as an imperialist tool. Finally, technology plays a very crucial role in the maintenance of the empire. The main reason that the US actively promoted the internet and gave it away for free was to spy on the rest of the world. As Edward Snowden revealed a decade ago, the US spies on everyone and everything using all the popular American software and hardware. Microsoft Outlook, Gmail, Skype, Intel chips, Seagate hard drives, and so on. In Europe, the US has tapped data centers to spy on every politician, business leader, and anyone deemed important. This way, the masters in Washington, D.C. can make sure that only the right people get elected and the elected leaders of the vassal countries don't try to rebel against the empire. Conclusion. As you can see, running an empire is a very complex task that involves not just brute force through military, but also the utilization of economic and financial tools, covert operations, ruthless murders, manipulation of mass psychology, etc. However, eventually, there is always blowback as other countries figure out the tactics and develop counter strategies. Plus, a system where participants are driven by free will and desire is always better than a tyrannical system based on coercion. And that is the future of a multipolar world with emphasis on multilateralism and win-win cooperation. BRICS is an excellent example of such a model. The next couple of years will determine the next few decades of the 21st century. Will it be a unipolar world that is run by globalists, or will it be a multipolar world of equals and partners? The end. So please like us and follow us on YouTube and Spotify. Follow the host, myself, S.L. Canthan, on Twitter X. My handle is @Canthan2030. Thank you.